Those evil, barbaric, uncivilized Persians invade our lands to steal our freedom and enslave our people. We stand as the last defense of civilization itself. Okay, hold on. That is totally unrealistic. The Persians weren't some evil, barbaric brutes. And what the heck are these clown uniforms? We look nothing like that. Man, you guys really have no idea what ancient Persia was like. Okay, get ready for a history lesson, guys. And put on some realistic clothes. There are many misconceptions about ancient Persia. The Persians weren't some evil monsters who rode beasts like some movies show. For over 1,000 years, Persia was one of the most powerful and influential civilizations in the world, and they built some of the largest empires in history. The Persians developed sophisticated systems of government, along with a rich and distinctive culture and artistic tradition. And for much of their rule, they were remarkably tolerant of the many peoples and religions within their empire, especially by the standards of the ancient world. This is the real story of ancient Persia. Before Persia became an empire, it was a small kingdom in the Iranian plateau, subordinate to the vast Median Empire. The Median Empire were the overlords of Persia and many other lands across Mesopotamia, and they were not so nice to their subjects. And to the west stood the powerful Neo-Babylonian Empire. The Persians were not yet a significant force in the region. They were still just some little babies, but that would change. A Persian king named Cyrus rebelled against the Median Emperor, who was his grandfather, by the way. The Median Empire was huge and powerful, and Cyrus didn't have a big enough army to conquer them, so he recruited help from disgruntled Median nobles and generals. At one point, a Median general named Harpagus was sent to stop Cyrus, but he and his army defected and joined Cyrus instead. Within a couple years, Cyrus had conquered the entire Median Empire. He decided to be nice and spare the Median nobility, absorbing them and the Median administrative systems into his new empire. Cyrus, who was now Cyrus the Great, called his new empire the Achaemenid Empire. Wait, no he didn't. Modern historians call it the Achaemenid Empire, after Achaemenes, the founder of the dynasty Cyrus the Great was a part of. But at the time, the Persians actually called their empire the Empire. Okay. And Cyrus would be the first Achaemenid emperor, who they called the King of Kings, or Shah in Persian. After conquering the Median Empire, Cyrus moved to the west. He defeated the Lydian Empire in 546 BC, bringing Anatolia under Persian control. Then, in 539 BC, he marched against the Neo-Babylonian Empire. Babylon itself was one of the greatest cities in the world at the time. When Cyrus entered the city, he didn't sack it, he was merciful with the people he conquered. He restored temples in his newly taken lands, including helping the Jews rebuild their temple in Jerusalem. Cyrus the Great didn't want to be a destroyer. He wanted to be seen as a legitimate and benevolent ruler who would bring order to the lands he conquered. This policy of tolerance would become a defining feature of Persian rule. The Persians themselves followed an ancient religion known as Zoroastrianism, a monotheistic religion that believed in one all-powerful god named Ahura Mazda, and it was established more than 3,000 years ago. The Achaemenids allowed their subjects to practice their own religions freely though. Zoroastrianism would not be imposed on their population. As long as you were loyal and paid your taxes, you could worship as you pleased. By the time Cyrus the Great died, Persia stretched from Anatolia to the Indus Valley. It was already the largest empire the world had ever seen, and it was only getting started. Cambyses II would succeed his father Cyrus, and he would conquer Egypt. But he wasn't as nice as his father. He executed Egyptians and even killed their sacred Apis bull. That was a jerk move. Cambyses was a cruel tyrant to the Egyptians, so unlike Persia's other provinces that were accepting of Persian rule, Egypt would always be a rebellious region. Some years later, Darius I would become Shah. He decided to improve the organization and bureaucracy of the Achaemenid Empire. The empire was already divided into provinces called satrapies, but Darius made the system more organized to prevent rebellion and ensure steady tax revenue. Each satrapy would be governed by a satrap, basically a governor, or mini-king. The satraps were watched carefully by military commanders and royal inspectors who answered directly to the King of Kings to prevent any suspicious activities and make sure that their province was paying taxes. Darius also built the Royal Road, stretching over 2,500 kilometers. Messages could travel across the empire in days. He introduced a standard currency, the Daric, to make trade easier. He also built mega projects, such as the Canal of the Pharaohs, basically an ancient version of the Suez Canal connecting the Red Sea to the Nile River. And he built a new capital city, Persepolis, from the ground up. Amazingly, these projects were built by skilled laborers, not slaves. Slavery was almost non-existent in the Achaemenid Empire, especially in the Persian heartland. Where slaves did exist, they had the right to marry, own property, and not be physically harmed. And they were mostly limited to household work. This is opposed to Western civilizations such as ancient Greece and later Rome, where slavery was much more common, with around 40% of their entire populations being enslaved. In Greece and Rome, slaves worked in brutal conditions in mines and had virtually no rights, and this is how most of the ancient world operated. The Persians were unique in this regard. Darius would also conquer new lands, bringing Persian rule to Thrace and Macedonia, right in Greece's backyard. Under Darius's rule, the Achaemenid Empire reached its territorial height. It ruled over millions of people, contained dozens of languages and cultures, and yet it was perfectly stable and held together. Well, it kinda held together. Between 499 and 494 BC, the Ionians revolted against Persian rule, and the Greek city-state of Athens supported them. The wealthy Persian city of Sardis would end up burned during the chaos. The Persians would eventually put the revolt down, but they were mad at Athens for aiding the Ionians. So Darius decided he would invade Greece as a punishment. He sent diplomats to the Greek cities, telling them to submit to Persian rule. Give us your land and water. Submit to Persian rule. You can't stop our empire, man. Never! This is Sparta! Okay, war it is. So, in 490 BC, Persian forces landed at Marathon and faced a Greek army half their size. But the Greeks, with their better armor and motivation to defend their homeland, defeated the Persians. Oh my gods! We won the battle! I must return to Athens to tell them the good news. Guys, we won the battle. 10 years later, the Persian Shah Xerxes would invade Greece again, with an army of hundreds of thousands of soldiers. Their army was so big that it was said to drink rivers dry. They invaded from the north, ready to conquer Greece, but they would first come across the famous 300 Spartans at the Battle of Thermopylae. But the Spartans weren't alone, as many think. They were accompanied by around 7,000 Greek allies from various city-states. Still, the Greeks were hopelessly outnumbered. The Greeks held a narrow passage called the Hot Gates, preventing the Persians from using their numerical advantage. The fighting lasted for days. The Persians would eventually break through and defeat the Greeks, but they lost tens of thousands of soldiers in the battle. The Persians would then march down to Athens and burn the city as revenge for the Ionian revolt. But within the next year, the Persians would lose at the Battle of Salamis and Plataea, ending their hopes of conquering Greece. Persia was still the biggest and most powerful empire in the world at that point, so things didn't seem too bad for them. Sure, their invasion of Greece didn't go too well, but they were able to burn Athens, sending a message to the rest of Greece. And it's not like the Greeks would remember this and conquer their entire empire in the future as revenge or anything. Nearly 2 centuries would pass with not too much happening. The Achaemenid Empire would continue to dominate the East. But in the west, a small, insignificant kingdom called Macedon would challenge Persian rule. The Macedonian king, Philip II, conquered Greece and had great ambitions to conquer the Greek-speaking lands in Anatolia from the Persians as revenge for them invading Greece centuries earlier. Philip was assassinated before he ever had the chance to, though, so his son Alexander would have to carry the torch. Alexander was much more ambitious than his father. He didn't just want to take Anatolia, he wanted to conquer the entire Achaemenid Persian Empire. In 334 BC, he crossed the Hellespont into Asia. Alexander won battle after battle, taking Anatolia, Syria, Palestine, and Egypt, where he founded the famous city of Alexandria. Then, in 330 BC, just 4 years into his campaign, he captured the heart of Persia and burned the ceremonial capital of Persepolis. The last Achaemenid Shah, Darius III, fled to the east. He tried to form a new army to defeat Alexander, but he was betrayed and killed by his own governors. With that, the Achaemenid Empire came to a sudden end. Alexander the Great had done the impossible. He conquered the entire Persian Empire, and he became a legend. But in 323 BC, Alexander the Great suddenly died to a fever in Babylon. He was only 32 years old, and he left behind no clear heir. When he was asked who should inherit his empire, Alexander replied, "To the strongest." That was not a helpful answer. Almost immediately, his generals began fighting over the empire. Within a few decades, Alexander's vast realm fractured into competing kingdoms. In Egypt, one of his generals, Ptolemy, established the Ptolemaic kingdom. In Macedon and Greece, the Antigonids ruled. And in the lands of Persia and Mesopotamia, Seleucus held power, and he would establish the massive Seleucid Empire. On paper, it was an impressive empire. The Seleucid rulers and elites were Greek, their cities were built in the Greek style. They founded new settlements across the region, most famously Antioch, spreading Hellenistic culture throughout the east. But beneath the surface, tensions remained. The Seleucid Empire was massive and difficult to control. It faced constant wars in the west against rival successor kingdoms, mainly the Ptolemies and Egypt, war in the east with the great Indian Mauryan Empire, and rebellions and incursions from nomads. In the mid-3rd century BC, on the northeastern frontier of the Seleucid Empire, an Iranian nomadic group known as the Parni began expanding into the region of Parthia. Their leader, Arsaces, rebelled against the Seleucids and declared independence. The Seleucids tried to crush them, but they had bigger problems. They had to deal with wars in Egypt and Anatolia, and all sorts of internal struggles and unrest. The Seleucid Empire was overstretched, which allowed the Parthians to slowly grow stronger without much resistance. They expanded gradually, pushing into Media, Persia, and Mesopotamia. They eventually captured the great city of Ctesiphon, making it their capital. By around 64 BC, the Seleucid Empire had effectively collapsed. What had once been the empire of Alexander the Great and his successors was now controlled by the Parthians, who had adopted much of Persia's culture and traditions, including the Zoroastrian religion. The Parthians weren't exactly like the old Achaemenid Empire, though. The Parthian Empire was far more decentralized. Powerful noble families controlled their own provinces and were much more independent than the old Achaemenid satraps. All they had to do was supply the Parthian emperor, who took the old title of King of Kings, with horse archers during times of war. The Parthians inherited much of the old Persian infrastructure. The royal road, first built under the Achaemenids, was still in use, making trade, travel, and sending mail fast and convenient. And around 130 BC, something even bigger was emerging: the Silk Road. Trade routes stretching from China to the Mediterranean passed directly through Parthian territory. Silk, spices, precious metals, glass, and gold flowed through this new trade route, and the Parthians were right in the middle of it. This made them mega wealthy. The empire also became a cultural crossroad, where Greek, Persian, Indian, and Asian influences blended together. The Parthians adopted elements of Hellenistic art and coinage, while still being more Persian than the Seleucids ever were. By the 1st century BC, the Parthian Empire was one of the most powerful in the world, but to the west, a new power was rising that would begin to challenge them: Rome. The Parthians would find themselves locked in a centuries-long struggle with the Romans. In 53 BC, a Roman general named Crassus invaded Parthian territory. The Roman people and Senate were completely against war with Parthia, as Parthia didn't invade them or cause any trouble, but Crassus wanted the war for his own personal glory. "We have to invade Parthia, for their gold, to stop them from getting massive weapons of destruction. They're going to get war elephants in the next 3 weeks." Crassus expected an easy victory, since his Roman legionaries were some of the best equipped soldiers in the world. But the Parthians had a trick up their sleeve. Sure, their soldiers just wore pajamas, but they fought as horse archers, allowing them to shoot the Romans at a distance and run away when they got too close. This made the Parthians almost impossible to kill in battle. So, at the Battle of Carrhae, the Parthians annihilated the Roman army. Crassus himself would be captured and later executed by having molten gold poured into his throat. At least he got the gold he wanted. This humiliating Roman defeat would lead many future Roman generals to invade the Parthians to get revenge. For the next 2 centuries, Rome and Parthia would clash repeatedly, with the Romans mostly being the aggressors. The Parthians would just sit back and defend their lands while the Romans would exhaust themselves with invasion after invasion. Around 117 AD, the Romans would actually conquer Mesopotamia, including the Parthian capital of Ctesiphon, but the Parthians would regain their territory within a year. Mesopotamia changed hands multiple times, but it would mostly be held by the Parthians. Over the centuries, all these wars did was drain the money and manpower of both the Romans and the Parthians. Neither side could fully defeat the other. Even though Rome could never conquer Parthia, they would be a constant nuisance. Also, wars in the east with the many Indian kingdoms and nomadic tribes would further weaken Parthia. But beneath the surface, the Parthians had a much bigger problem to worry about. Parthia's decentralized system was unstable, leading to rivalry between the nobles over who would have the throne. In 224 AD, a Persian ruler from the region of Persis named Ardashir rebelled against the Parthian Empire, and he overthrew the Parthian king. The Arsacid dynasty fell, and Ardashir established a new empire in its place, the Sassanid Empire. The new emperor Ardashir was from Persis, the same region where Achaemenid kings like Cyrus the Great and Darius had once ruled centuries earlier, and he saw himself as restoring Persia to its old greatness. The Parthians had ruled for nearly 500 years, and Ardashir and his supporters felt that Parthia had allowed Persia to become weaker, more fragmented, and lose its ancient Persian identity. So the Sassanids looked back to the old Achaemenids as a model for their new empire, back to their great imperial traditions and culture, a revival of ancient Persia. The Sassanids again adopted the ancient title King of Kings, or Shah. Their art and architecture deliberately echoed the old Achaemenid styles. They brought back many of the legal protections that slaves had during the times of the Achaemenid Empire. And they saw the disorder that the decentralized system under the Parthians brought, so they wanted to strengthen central authority under a far stronger monarchy. Provincial governors called satraps, yep, the satraps are back, answered directly to the King of Kings, ensuring that he had full control over all the regions in his empire. The empire became more structured, more bureaucratic, and more disciplined. This centralized plan made the Sassanids much more powerful and wealthy compared to the old Parthian Empire. The Sassanids expanded trade within their empire and the Silk Road, and were more effective in collecting taxes, which made them mega wealthy. But perhaps the most significant revival was in the empire's religion. Under the Sassanids, Zoroastrianism became the state religion. While the old Achaemenids had practiced Zoroastrianism, they ruled with a high degree of religious tolerance. The Sassanids were a bit different. They actively promoted Zoroastrianism across their empire. Religious minorities such as Christians, Jews, and Manichaeans were sometimes tolerated, but they were also persecuted at times. Christian communities especially were viewed with distrust, because the rival of the Sassanids, the Roman Empire, itself became Christian. The Sassanids wanted to forge an empire that was more homogeneous in its culture and religion, so they were more assertive in pushing Zoroastrianism and Persian culture, which ironically was a departure from the more tolerant Achaemenid Empire they were trying to emulate. The Sassanids would not rise unchallenged though. To the west still stood the mighty Roman Empire, the same empire that the Parthians had fought for centuries, and the Sassanids approached that rivalry very differently. The Parthians were pretty laid back when it came to Rome, and they only played defensively when the Romans invaded them. The Sassanids, on the other hand, were much more aggressive. Under Shapur I in the 3rd century AD, Persian armies pushed aggressively into Roman territory. Cities were captured, Roman legions were defeated, and in 260 AD, at the Battle of Edessa, something crazy happened. The Roman Emperor Valerian was captured alive. No Roman emperor had ever been taken prisoner by a foreign power. Valerian would be a prisoner for the rest of his life, working as a slave and even being used as a footstool by Shapur when mounting his horse. For Rome, it was a humiliation. For Persia, it was proof that they were a mighty empire that even surpassed the Romans. But Rome was not so easily broken. Over the next several centuries, the Roman, and later Byzantine Empire, remained Persia's constant enemy. Persia's western frontier with Rome was a constant battlefield contested by both powers. The Kingdom of Armenia became an important piece on the board during these wars. Their location and geography made them a perfect highway to invade the other. When Armenia was allied with Rome, the Romans could march through their territory to invade deep into the Persian heartland. When Armenia was allied with Persia, the Sassanids could easily invade deep into Anatolia. In this centuries-long struggle between the two empires, there were moments when Persia gained the upper hand, and others when Roman armies seemed to be winning, but neither side could land a decisive, permanent blow. Between 526 and 532 AD, one of these wars raging between the Sassanids and the Romans was the Iberian War, where a famous Byzantine general, Belisarius, made a name for himself. The Iberian War turned out to be another pointless struggle that didn't lead to much change in territory, so the Byzantines, led by Emperor Justinian, and the Sassanids, led by Emperor Khosrow I, signed a peace treaty called the Eternal Peace. The two great empires decided it was finally time to make peace and end their bloody rivalry. But this eternal peace would end just 8 years later, with the two empires resuming their wars. These constant wars between Rome and the Persians drained both of them. Armies required constant funding, fortifications had to be built, maintained, and repaired, provinces devastated by invasion needed rebuilding. This rivalry became a permanent strain on both empires. In the early 7th century, this cycle of constant fighting escalated into the most destructive war either side had ever fought. The Byzantine Empire was dealing with internal chaos when their emperor Maurice was overthrown and beheaded by the usurper Phocas. This led to a civil war and chaos in the Byzantine Empire. Also, the Sassanid king Khosrow II was friends with Emperor Maurice, so he was mad when his buddy was executed. Seizing the moment, Khosrow launched a massive invasion of Rome. Persian armies surged west with stunning success. They conquered most of Anatolia, Syria, Palestine, and Egypt. When they captured Jerusalem, they took the True Cross, one of Christianity's most sacred relics, with them back to Persia. For a time, it seemed like Khosrow might finally achieve what generations of Sassanid kings had attempted, the decisive defeat of the Roman Empire. But the new Byzantine ruler, Emperor Heraclius, refused to surrender. Instead of losing all hope, he launched a bold counteroffensive, marching his armies deep into Persian territory. The war dragged on for years, brutal and exhausting for both sides. By 628 AD, this struggle proved too much for Persia. Internal rebellion erupted, Khosrow II was overthrown and executed by his own nobles, and a rapid succession of rulers followed in a chaotic manner. In the end, Rome reconquered its lost territory, and Persia was left with nothing to gain from this devastating war. Both empires were shattered. Cities lay in ruins, treasuries were depleted, armies were exhausted. Decades of total war had greatly weakened the two superpowers, and soon a new force emerged from the south. In the Arabian Peninsula, tribes that had long been politically divided were now united under a new religion, Islam. Energized by religious conviction and political unity, Muslim armies expanded beyond Arabia with remarkable speed. They first struck the weakened Byzantine Empire, taking Palestine, Syria, and Egypt. Then they turned east, towards Persia. The Sassanid Empire, already weakened by war with Rome and civil unrest, struggled to mount a coordinated defense. In 636 AD, at the Battle of El-Qadisiyah, Persian forces suffered a decisive defeat. Soon after, the great capital of Ctesiphon fell. The Sassanids would resist conquest for a while, but over time, province after province would be lost. In 651 AD, the last Sassanid king, Yazdegerd III, was killed while fleeing east. And with that, the Sassanid Empire had come to an end. The Sassanids were the last ancient Persian empire, so their fall marked the end of an era. But they were not the last empire or civilization in Persia, not at all. As the Persian classical age came to an end, a new medieval world was just beginning. Under the rising Islamic caliphates, Persia didn't fade away, it became one of the cultural and intellectual centers of the Muslim world. Persian scholars, administrators, and traditions played a major role in shaping the governance and bureaucracy of these new empires. And Persian culture would heavily influence what became known as the Islamic Golden Age, one of the most influential periods in world history. This video took me more than 100 hours to make. The research, writing, building the worlds, acting out the scenes, and recording them takes a lot of work. So I would greatly appreciate it if you would consider joining the channel as a member to support my work. You also get some benefits, like custom emojis, badges, and shoutouts at the higher levels, so it's a win-win. Your support truly means a lot to me. Thanks for watching, bruvs.